Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. And it's now the slightly long-awaited, you've waited a couple of weeks for the tutorial for this robe, the dressing gown that I featured in Le Baton Rouge, this burgundy dark garnet red chiffon, polyester chiffon dressing gown that I made for that video with its absolutely gigantic sleeves. And you will be needing quite a lot of fabric to make something like this. I recommend a wider width chiffon or georgette, either silk or polyester. I used polyester because I wanted this to be washable and a little bit hardier. Silk, of course, chiffon is a bit of a delicate fabric, and knowing me, I'd get hooked on door handles and rip that thing apart in no time, so I needed something a little bit sturdier. So actually a polyester is a better pick for me for things that I'm going to wear all the time around the house. Because I do work from home, I'm sitting here in front of my computer, and this is the perfect sort of glamorous outfit to wear with no makeup and my bangs sticking up funny when I want to feel more glamorous sitting here editing. But I digress. You're here for the tutorial. Let's jump on over to the blue patterning table of doom and get started. But first I wanted to show you some of the images that were inspiring me to make a robe like this. I saw this pinup Halloween image on Pinterest and thought, I really need that robe. And I saw the second image, which clearly is from the same photo shoot, showing that the sleeve was indeed open, because I couldn't exactly tell what was going on with the sleeve at first. But those were the images that inspired me to make a robe like this one with absolutely gargantuan sleeves. But you can see I have a mirrored copy of my bodice block front here. I just mirrored that along the center front so I can have a full front, because we're going to draw in a wrap. And I'm just going to come down from the neckline to about 2 inches above the waist on the opposite side. So across like so, and I'm drawing this curve where it intersects with the apex of the bust on this side. And then on this side, I'm going to eliminate this side dart. I couldn't decide if I wanted to do the waist dart too. I ended up leaving the waist dart right where it was, but this side dart will go up into the shoulder yoke that I'm going to create here today as well. So this is actually very simple, especially if you watch, let's say, like my red silk shirt video recently. It's kind of similar modifications with the yoke and putting the gathering up into the yoke and such. But I can start cutting this out, and I'll cut this little yoke off apart here, like so. And then that's the front yoke, and I need to add seam allowance to that, and also back onto the body, because anytime I cut my pattern apart, I need to add seam allowance if I plan on sewing it back together, like so. So I'll just tape this here so I can recall that, like so. And I'm leaving the rest of this extra paper over here because I'm going to close this side dart up into the yoke seam there, like so. Close that side dart. I've just moved it up into the yoke. I could sew this as a dart if I wanted to, but of course I'm going to use it as gathering today. And I'll fill this in with some spare paper. Lots of tape, of course, as usual. And I am going to square off the side of this, and again, a similar way that I did with that silk shirt recently. So I will go ahead and link that video in a card, because this is a similar construction process actually for this today. So I have that dart moved, that new fullness in. I'm going to add some more fullness here at the underarm area. I'm going to add 2 inches from the original underarm, and I'm going to square out, or square down, I suppose, from there, and that will be the width of my front. And I'm actually going to square up from that and blend into the rest of the area. So I'm going to ignore the original arm side entirely at this point and really like rectangulify and geometricify this whole thing, so we have a much more rectangular shape. And I am just measuring that distance where I came out from the underarm, that 2 inches. I'm just squaring that off to the center front, and then I'm going to go ahead and square off this waistline as well before I layer the dart on this opposite wrap side closed. I do like to overlap that a little bit extra, so instead of just closing the dart, I overlap the tip a little bit just to avoid any gaping, usually around at least 1/4 inch, and I'll tape that down and smooth out this waistline. I couldn't decide if I wanted to sew on a separate skirt or not at this point, but you'll see how I end up lengthening this later. But I can go ahead and cut out my rather rectangular wrap front shape here. All of this extra fullness up here that I added in to facilitate a very, geometric sleeve. We don't have to set in the sleeve at this point. It's just going to be sewn on. This all gets gathered down back into that yoke. And from the underarm area, I'm going to come down about 1.5 inches, and that want to make sure that this is about 10 inches, basically, for my new, I guess, flat arm side. It's not like a shaped arm side anymore. It's going to be flat, kind of like a kimono is done, like an actual kimono, which of course many robes and dressing gowns from the turn of the century through, well, actually the late Victorian era through the mid-20th century were inspired by Japanese kimono anyhow. For the back, I am just going to trace a copy of my bodice back, draw in the yoke however deep I want it. I actually wish I brought this down a tiny bit more, but that's all right. 1 inch or there doesn't make the world of difference, honestly. Drawing where my center back is so I can have this yoke be the correct shape. And in fact, I was about to have 1 inch of extra here at the center back for the main body of it, but because I'm adding this 2 inches at the side, that's 4 inches across the back that I'm adding, and I'm ignoring the dart that's here at the waist entirely. I didn't feel like I needed that extra inch, so I cut it off later on. But let me cut off my yoke from the rest of this, Again, I just squared around from that 2 inches out from the underarm area here, just making this into a rectangle. But here I am cutting off the excess at the center back. This will be cut in the fold. And this is now my back rectangle that is going to gather down into my yoke. And let me cut out my yoke here. And I need to add seam allowance to both these pieces as well. I do get comments every so often asking why I add seam allowance to my patterns. When, like, some people do this the opposite way. Instead of having seam allowance on their block patterns and then adding it, as I always do, like this, they just remember to cut everything out with seam allowance. And because I was trained this way, actually when I went to fashion school, at least my freshman year, I would get in trouble if I didn't add seam allowance. Like, it would be points off of my grade. So this is just how I was taught, and therefore my brain is programmed to do it this way. And if I didn't have seam allowance included in my patterns, I'm sure I would forget often enough when cutting things out to add it that it would become an extreme frustration in my life and I would end up wasting a lot of fabric. So at this point, this is how I am. If you do your patterns without seam allowance and just know to cut things with an extra ½ inch everywhere you want, good for you. But I don't see, either way isn't wrong. It's just, this is the way I do it, is to have seam allowance on my patterns. It's how I was trained when I went to fashion school, and therefore how my brain works now. But now I have my bodice front and back, rather rectangular looking pieces, and this sleeve piece is actually just a large geometric shape anyhow. So I have a large right angle here drawn for the beginning of my sleeve with a very large piece of paper, and I'm going to come down on this axis here about 45 inches for the length of my sleeve. I'm actually off camera now holding a measuring tape up, like from the end of my hand, to see where it hits the floor, to see how long I want to make these sleeves. You can make them as long or as short as you want. You can make them long enough to trail behind you. You can make them a lot shorter, whatever you want to do, You want to make them at least 30 or 40 inches long, I would say, to be able to have them tie in the back like mine do, but you can do whatever you wish. And then my sleeve itself is about 23 inches long, which is about an inch longer than my normal sleeve anyhow, up here on the other axis of this L, basically. And I'm just drawing in a huge curve between those two to make my giant curved semicircle sleeves here. So yeah, this is, at this point out here is where my wrist will be, and then down here is at the hem of these sleeves, where they will kind of hit the back of my shins, really. But it's just a giant semicircle. That's the length I want and like the width of my arm, basically. And again, this doesn't have like a shaped armhole. This is just going to be flat and sewn on flat. So that's the same 10 inches down that I made the mark on my bodice pieces. Hopefully this makes any sense. This is one of those things where it's like actually so simple that I find it hard to explain because it's easy, honestly, if anything. But here I have my back bodice piece, and I'm just going to add on, going to extend this rectangle. So this rectangle is wide enough that it should encompass my hips. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my seam allowance on here and just layer that closed so my brain can make sense of it. And then I'm going to flare this out a little bit, but I'm just going to start by drawing in the rectangle itself. So I'm just going to extend that piece all the way down as long as I want this to be, which in the end I make this robe too short by about 5 or 6 inches. So that's unfortunate. At least the sleeves were long enough. But the robe itself, like from the waist here to the floor, I underestimated, which is a shame. It does mean that this robe is a lot more practical because I won't trip over it all the time because it is a bit shorter, especially in the front. But here I'm about, 10 inches off compared to what I think I need to do. I don't know how I managed that, but eh. But anyway, the rectangle is extended as long as you want this to be. Make it a little longer than you think. Small recommendation. And I'm just going to angle this out a little bit from the side. I don't know how much of an angle this is, maybe 25 degrees or something. I'm not using a protractor, as you can tell. You can make this a lot wider if you want to have like a circle skirt or like a full A-line to a circle skirt kind of shape. I'm just adding a little bit of flare here because I think the gathering is going to provide enough fullness. I didn't want to super exaggerate this, but you can see I'm planning on this training behind me, but for some reason, making it only 50 inches at the sides was not working out. I probably just miscalculated. Here I'm widening it a little bit more. So in the end, this flare is probably about 35, 40 degrees. If you want to be technical about it. Which, why? This is supposed to be a creative process. We don't need to use any actual math. Well, maybe we do, and then you'll end up with the correct hem length, honestly. This is still going to be cut on the fold along the center back, but now the center back is full length, and I will do the same sort of process here for the front. Again, taping on a large piece of paper. Let's grab some paper here, and extending this all the way down, all that stuff, and again, making the front especially about 6 inches too short. So that is a shame. And because this is curved because of the wrap, I just ignore it and straighten it off down. Again, this is a rather simple shape of robe. You don't need to get I mean, you can get hyper couture about it, but this is not supposed to be something that's contoured to the body very closely. It's just supposed to be this like loose kimono-ish robe. So that's kind of the situation here. Again, just squaring that off. It's 21 3/4 is the width of my top piece here. So and then I think because this is so wide, I didn't even bother to flare the side of this. So there's that. Could add flare to the side seam, just like the back if you would like. But it's most important just to make sure that you line up your side seam from the back and the front to make sure it matches up. And here I am adding a little bit of length onto the back, and yet it still wasn't enough, honestly. It's a shame. How did I add 3 inches to the back here of the hem, and yet it still isn't long enough? Thank goodness I did this, otherwise it would be really short. But here I am walking that side seam to make sure that it lines up, like so that will still line up and the back will be a lot longer than the front, and yet... Then I grabbed my huge sleeve pattern as well, and I laid this all out in the other part of the basement. Sorry for this terrible footage, but I needed to use quite a lot of fabric just because these pieces are quite wide and that sleeve is gigantic. I needed 4 of those big sleeve pieces because there is a seam along the top of the arm, as opposed to, you could cut it on the fold, but again, you would need even more fabric for that. So you do need a lot of fabric for this one. I probably used about, I don't even know, I think I ordered 6 yards of this and I didn't have a ton left over. So, ooh, that's another reason to use polyester chiffon. It's a lot cheaper if you're going to need that much fabric. Mostly the sleeves eat up the fabric. The body of it, it's like 3 yards probably for the body. And like the yokes, obviously, no fabric here. But the sleeves take up maybe like 3 or 4 yards just on their own to cut these out. So depending on the width of your fabric, depending on the size of your sleeve and yourself, it all depends, as usual. And I just cut out some black Chantilly lace that I had in stock here to use as an overlay over these yokes as well, and I'm going to flat line that to my yokes using the serger over here. I did a test piece and it seemed to work fine, so I'm going to go ahead and run that through the serger. I will use some French seams today, in addition to also using the serger to like fray check basically some edges of this. But for basting all this, you could hand baste, of course, especially if you're doing something a little bit finer and not sort of a costume piece like I'm doing here. I mean, it's a costume for this video, but I will wear it around the house from now on, of course. But I might make a like fancier couture version of this sometime with actual silk one day, if I feel like I can be trusted with it, which truly I cannot, because I am rather clumsy and not elegant in reality. But my yokes here all basted together with its lace. I need to put gathering stitching across the center of my back piece here to gather this down. I was just kind of deciding where I wanted that gathering to be. It's about I'm keeping the sides of this about 5 inches on the sides smooth, but I will put my 2 lines of parallel gathering stitching in here along the sides, tie off one side of it, gather this down to fit, and then I'm going to actually do a French seam here. So I'm going to sew this wrong sides together and then trim the seam, and then I'll scooch it around and sew right sides together afterwards. I find French seams confusing and annoying, but in a sheer fabric, it is kind of the best finish to use. So that's what I'll be doing today. Even though I'm also using serging on this, and it's like, why not just go all the way and use all French seams or all serging? I don't know. No one can explain the decisions I made while on a whole load of Delsum cough medicine anyway, you know? October was a weird month for me this year. I had a lot of hopes for it, and half of them were waylaid by the fact that I did get COVID during October, so this is in recovery mode still. Although at this point I do think I was testing negative, so that's nice. But after I have that sewn wrong sides together, I will go ahead and trim this seam, like I said. And then I can go ahead and press my seam allowance up. I'm just going to press it all in one direction, just to get it a little bit smoother. And then I will play with this in my fingers and kind of roll it between my fingers to really get to the edge of where that seam is. And then I'm going to pin this so that the raw edges will be encased. Oh, by the way, I sewed this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance the first round, and then I'm going to sew this again with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that I'm still using up my 1/2 inch seam allowance that I put onto my pattern. I'm just doing it in a different way. Things I forget to mention, honestly. I promised this project, which you probably have noticed since this video, we're already halfway through it, it's only a half hour long. This project is not that difficult. The only difficult thing about it is, A, you need a lot of fabric, so it's on the pricier side. And, well, I mean, I paid $5 a yard for this fabric, so it wasn't too pricey. But also, just working with large pattern pieces, both in the paper and in fabric itself, is kind of annoying, unless you're a quilter and you're used to working with, you know, coverlet-sized pattern pieces, coverlet-sized pieces of fabric. It can be kind of irritating to be manipulating and whipping this much fabric around the sewing room and not getting caught on things or getting, the corner of one thing stuck underneath while you're stitching another seam. So do be careful, but it's not actually, like, there's no parts of this that are, there's no steps of this that are actually difficult. It's just kind of a lot because there's a lot of fabric involved. But it's, again, just very geometric shapes with the yoke, honestly. But my back and my back yokes are together. Now I need to do the front and the front yokes. So same idea, put the gathering stitching in along the top where it needs to be attached to the yoke. Hopefully, if my machine decides to behave. Come on now, buddy. There we go. But I'm just using the edge of my presser foot as a guide to have these two lines of gathering stitching close together in parallel, using again the largest stitch setting on my machine. But I will pull my gathering stitching to the top of my fabric here, tie off one side, and gather this down to fit my yoke. Of course, there's a right and a left here on this front, so I have to do this twice in reverse. And again, pinning things wrong sides together, it just feels so unusual to me. I am not a French seam user. Ooh. But I'll gather this down to fit, and again, kind of space my gathers out so that things are nice and sit nicely. You could pleat something like this too if you wanted to, or just use less gathering in general. I use kind of a lot because I knew the chiffon could handle it. Basically, chiffon really, out of any fabric, can handle a ton of gathering. You could put way more in here if you wanted to. But again, the more fabric you have while you're running around your house, running away from ghosts or whatever, or running towards them, either way, crimson peeking it around the house, the more fabric there is, the more chance you're going to get stuck on something. So that's just my 2 cents there, I suppose. But again, I have that sewn with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, then I trimmed it, and now I'm pinning it right sides together so that we can encase that raw seam allowance, and there will be no raw edge on this seam. French seams. If you watch Angela Clayton, which you should, then you've seen many a French seam because she does them all the time over there. She's a more patient person than I am, that's for sure. And an incredibly talented seamstress, for sure. But I will just press that down now that it is finished, like so. A nice, clean, slightly puffy French seam on these. So now my front yokes are done. I can go ahead and sew the shoulder seams of my yokes. You could do the yoke all in one piece, by the way, if you wanted to. Have this, like, eliminate the shoulder seam. Anytime there's like a straight seam like this, if you just layer the pattern pieces closed along the seam allowance and tape them shut, you don't have to have this seam up here. I quite like having a shoulder seam because it adds a little bit of structure right along the shoulder. So instead of like this where I'm not using a shoulder pad, I can take all the structure I can get because the stronger the shoulder, the smaller the waist, as I always say. But I'll go ahead and stitch these with the regular 1/2 inch seam allowance over here because they are serged and I'm not going to be using French seams along this one. But you can see the French seam for the back there on the left-hand side of the screen under my hand. So I'm using both seam finishes for this. Again, don't ask me why. I don't know what I'm doing. This is the top edge along my arm of my giant sleeves. Like I said, I needed to cut out 4 of those sleeve pieces so that I could have a front and a back and a left and right sleeve. So I'm going to stitch that all along this seam. This I am going to use French seams again, so I'm going to sew it once with 1/4 inch seam allowance, trim it down, and do that little twisty twist to sew the other side. French seam, basically, once again. Am I making any sense? As usual. Somehow, even with something this simple, I managed to complicate it. Yes, of course. But yes, so this seam up here that I'm working on is this line on my drawing. So if you look at the sketch, that's this top of my arm. And yes, again, it would be nice to cut this all in one or cut that piece on the fold so that there was no seam along the top of the arm, but we're talking a ton of fabric in that case, so it depends on if you get a deal or not on your fabric, because to cut that on the fold would require a lot of fabric. You could cut it on the cross grain and cut it on like all one giant piece, but you do you, I guess. I would rather just have a seam and not have to buy another 4 yards of fabric, honestly. But yes, I've turned this wrong sides out. Again, this fabric doesn't help with this French seamed explanation, seeing as both sides are the same and it's all sheer, but you get what I mean. And I can finish up this French seam along the sleeve, and of course I will do the same for the other sleeve as well. Right now, again, they are the same front and back, the same right and left, because this fabric is the same on either side, which is not helpful in tutorials. Really, I should choose something that has an obvious face. Now for the side of the sleeve seam, not the hem, the curved hem I'm just going to leave as is for now, but the side of the sleeve that like hangs down at my side, like the underarm seam in any other sleeve, I'm going to go ahead and serge the raw edges of that. And also the long edges of the robe itself, the long edges of the side seam, I will serge those as well. And now this is one of the sleeves laid out right side up, and I've just made a pin 10 inches down from the shoulder seam on either side. I guess the shoulder seam. This seam along my arm, which is also my shoulder seam. And I'm going to line up that French seam I did in the sleeve with my shoulder seam on the bodice, on the body of the garment. And again, this is like where I was marking 10 inches down on both the front and the back. That's where it's going to attach the sleeve. This is being attached on flat. You don't have to set in the sleeve. I haven't sewn my side seams for either the sleeve or the main body yet. I will do that after the sleeves are sewn on. So you're sewing it on like a big like T, basically. Again, see that silk shirt video to get a better idea perhaps of how sleeves are sewn on flat like this, because it is kind of hard to explain today. If you're used to actually setting in sleeves. This is much easier, of course, because you don't have to fiddle with setting in sleeves. So, and I can just go ahead and stitch that 1/2 inch seam allowance over here on the machine. Again, this is all the areas where things are serged, so there's no raw edges in here. So now that that is sewn, I will go ahead and press that open, and then I will sew the side seams of both the sleeve and the gown all at once. I will kind of box around the top corner where they go together, but again, there's so much ease and extra floop going on here that it's not going to matter. So like, this is the underarm right here, I'm lining that up. I'm going to sew both the side seam and the underarm seam all at once in one go. One very long seam where I pivot at the underarm, basically. And of course, my camera runs out of battery here, and I did not get a shot of this, which is not helpful. But look at the sketch. Basically, the long underarm seam of this gigantic sleeve and the long seam of the side of the robe. I'm going to sew both of those at once, which means the whole thing will be essentially constructed at this point. And everything will be mostly finished, except for the hems of all the stuff. So to hem my sleeves, and to hem along the neckline edge, like the opening of the wrap front, I am going to use bias tape. In fact, to hem the robe itself, I'm going to use bias tape. And I'm cutting, this is polyester shantung that I had here in stock. I'm cutting some wide, this is 4-inch wide bias to use on the hem. Everywhere else I used 3-inch wide bias, which when made into double fold like this comes down to 1 inch wide. And this is going to be 1.5 inches wide for my hem, just because I was trying to get any length I could at that point. But for the front opening edge of this, and that, which goes around the neckline as well, and for the sleeves, I just used this double fold that finishes out at 1 inch wide. Again, I was cutting that on the 45-degree angle over there, and I'm just going to sew this bias on over all my raw edges that remain, basically. You can see me hem with bias in this video where I talk about different hem finishes, because I do use bias to hem anything that is curved usually, and to do a lot of work, especially in costuming, I use bias to finish things. So it's actually very useful to cut bias tape and make your own out of whatever fabric you like. Obviously this doesn't match, it's just coordinating basically, and it's part of the reason I use black lace with this, so that I could use this black to finish all my edges. And I'm using the wider bias tape here to finish the curved hem of this. And again, here's how you actually put this on. This is sewing the first round. You sew this right sides together, the bias on like so, just one edge of it, and then you can flip everything to the inside, fold everything smooth, pin it in place, like I'm about to show you here, fold my ends in, fold this to the inside, and so we have a nice finished edge in here, and you can hand stitch this down, which is what I normally do when working with costuming or like any finer projects, but again, in a polyester dressing gown, I will just machine stitch this down into place after I have everything ready to go. And this hem does have a bit of a curve, so bias is perfect for that. Especially if you've never hemmed a circle skirt with a bias tape hem. It's life-changing, honestly. So definitely give it a try if you are frustrated easily by curved hems, because bias makes all the difference. And then to finish this off, I wanted to use some like Venetian lace style appliques to go ahead and just kind of paste these over my seams to make my yoke blend into the rest of the robe well. So I just placed those where I want them and pinned them down, and then I really stitched these down quite, not loosely, but I just like whip stitched them down along the edges of the lace and not like even everywhere. Just kind of messily stitch these on, but like you cannot see because of the stitching of the lace itself. So I just was like making sure I secured these down around the edges, but I was just whipping it with little tiny stitches on. It's kind of hard to film in black on black anyhow, but I just hand stitched these on. I didn't take ages to do it. It was not perfect. Once again, if this were a silk robe for like my wedding or something, I would spend more time, but this is a polyester dress for sitting around the house, you know? And then the last thing to do for this was to make a belt, of course, to match. So I just grabbed the rest of my chiffon. You can see I tore this along. So I just tore two, as long as I could get basically out of the leftover yardage, pieces that were 6 inches wide. And then I stitched those two strips together and then all along into a ribbon like so, or into a tube, I guess, that I can turn right side out in a minute to use as a belt. And then I'll just finish the edges. You can see my machine tension was not perfect for this fabric at this point, but this was, you know, in the race to the finish line of getting that lookbook together before Halloween, so I couldn't care, sadly. As soon as it's pressed, it looks a lot better, so not too bad. And the last thing to do with this whole robe was I tacked the two ends of the sleeves together at the back sleeve hem. I tacked those together to stitch them together, and then I stitched a tassel onto it, which is nice because it kind of weighs this down as well and also makes it look a little bit more finished and intentional to have this little tassel back here. Could be fun to have like a beaded tassel as well, or some sort of a charm or ornament hanging back here. But that's just how I tacked my sleeves together. And with that, this robe is finished. And here is my finished garnet red, deep red dressing gown from the Le Baton Rouge lookbook. And of course, I'll be wearing this all the time here, especially because it is too short. As I mentioned, I would like to have made this at least 6 inches longer, the robe itself. The sleeves are long enough, but the rest, I really missed a trick there somehow. But I might add on some black lace or some sort of a ruffle to the end of the hem of this, just because I've seen some like black pleated chiffon trims that I can pick up for pretty cheap on Etsy and toss on there and pretend it was intentional all the while. Thank you for your patience waiting for this video. I have had many requests for it, so I know that some of you are clamoring to make this for yourself, and I hope this was helpful in that regard. And thank you as always for watching today. I'll be back here with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye.